Well, good morning, folks. The hour has come, and I want to introduce once again John Edgar, who is with us to do part 2 of the seminar on a front porch for all people. And first of all, I want to say thank you to Susan Eisenman, who cannot be with us this morning, but Peggy Malone is with us this morning, and these two women have sponsored John Edgar's presence with us here at Lakeside. So we want to say thank you very much to you folks. Yes. Now, I just want to say by word of introduction, my own association with Reverend John Edgar. I was a district superintendent in the East Ohio Conference of the United Methodist Church at the same time that John was a district superintendent in West Ohio. And it was a tradition at that time for every year or so for the superintendents and the bishops of both conferences to get together. And we were supposed to share ideas, and mostly we just shared wounds, I think. But anyway, we did get together, and at that time I got to know John. Well, he eventually retired as I did, and in a marvelous way has continued on his ministry in South Columbus, and he's still, of course, working with the project, although he's officially retired. Some of us have trouble retiring. Sue says he has trouble retiring. I don't know anybody like that. Anyway, it's so good to have John here and his wife, Sue Wolf, and to share with us about this ministry that my hope is that not only will we be inspired, but we can take some kernels of these ideas back home and even at Lakeside. What can we do here? What can we do in our home communities? And how can we inspire others to do? I think all of our churches, and I'm not going to get into a sermon, all of our churches have more resources and more potential than we think we do. And I found that out as a district superintendent. There are wonderful people in every church, and there are wonderful things going on in every church. And we just have to lift those up and move those ahead. So without further ado, let's give a warm Lakeside welcome to the Reverend John Edgar.
Good morning. Delightful to have a chance to be back with you for this second session. As I look around, I know that some of you were here yesterday and some were not. And so I'm going to take just a brief moment to kind of do, not a review everything I talked about, but to set the context. So my wife and I, for the last really 25 years now, have been part of a ministry in the inner city on the south side of Columbus that has become the United Methodist Church for All People. And this congregation that we launched then also operates a community development corporation that does outreach into the community. So this church is, as I was saying yesterday, in some respects, the most diverse United Methodist Church in the country, at least in terms of the intersection of race and social class. And thus, this congregation is about 50% white, 50% black, just like the neighborhood. And there are a smattering of people who are new Americans from various parts of the world. And then this church also has been, actually from before its inception, involved in direct services and trying to transform quality of life in the community on the south side of Columbus. As a matter of fact, all of these ministries emerged from what's known as the United Methodist Free Store that Sue and I and some others launched in January of 1999. At that time, I was a district superintendent. And this store was designed to share gently used clothing and household items with low-income people free of charge. And we invited people from all the different churches that made up the Columbus South District, 78 congregations, where I was the district superintendent, to gather up items, bring those things down, and then build relationships with people who came to shop. Well, this worked pretty well. It's grown to the point where in any given year there are 20,000 plus individuals that shop in the free store. And we launched the church out of the people who came to shop and volunteer. Along the way, we also have developed a number of other ministries and direct services. We operate, for example, what's known as the All People's Fresh Market, and about 30+ thousand folks come and shop there every year, different people. It's designed for people to eat healthy, to live healthy. It's just fruits, vegetables, and dairy products. We do a bunch of other kinds of outreach programming with children. I talked a lot yesterday that we become a developer of affordable housing, and we run some social enterprises, a bike shop, a coffee shop, an art gallery, and art workshop space. So that's kind of who we are and what we've been doing. Today, I want to focus on two things in addition to the big point I tried to make yesterday. Yesterday, I talked about that all this works because, as we discovered through the free store, where we never ran out of good things to give away, we came to the conviction of what I think is just a fundamental truth of reality, that you and I live inside a divine economy of abundance, not scarcity. In other words, God ordered creation itself. So there's more than enough of every good gift for every good purpose if you and I would just take what God's entrusted to us and share it forward. No matter how meager the resources or gifts that we have, if we decide to take some of that and use it for God's purposes, God does amazing things with it. And that's what we saw in the free store, and that's what happened as we started really small and developing housing, and then grew to the point where we've done $150 million of affordable housing on the South Side. So that was yesterday. So today, I'm going to lift up two other key ideas, which also have written about in much more detail in the book that came out last year called A Front Porch for All People, and there are copies that you can get if you'd like after this presentation is over. But these other two main concepts I want to talk about are radical hospitality and touching grace. And so to center for a while on this notion of the importance of hospitality, certainly to our ministries, but I think to any kind of Christian outreach at all. And so to start with, part of the reason that we became so focused on hospitality is that we were doing ministry that was attempting to cross all kinds of chasms of divisions in our society. I mean, first of all, we're just trying to bring together black and white folks. And quite frankly, in America today, including in the United Methodist Church, of which we're a part, that's not always easy to do. There's so many layers of separation. And likewise, when we were trying to bridge not only race, but social class, once again, it takes a lot of intentionality to be able to get to the place where folks are going to know each other, trust each other, and move beyond. And so we early on gravitated to a notion of using hospitality to start to bridge differences and create a common ground on which, over time, we can build authentic relationships of mutuality. So to jump into that a little bit, I would suggest to you that throughout all of Scripture, hospitality is actually a very key virtue. One of the earliest stories about hospitality in the Bible occurs in the 18th chapter of Genesis. It's the story about Abraham and Sarah in their old age. At the point of this story, Abraham is almost 100 years old, Sarah is nearly 90, and we're told that Abraham and Sarah are in their tent at an oasis, and Abraham is just kind of resting outside the front door of his tent, and off in the distance he sees three strangers who are approaching. And Abraham gets up and he rushes out to them, and he invites these strangers to pause so that he can show some kindness to them. And if you were to go back and read the 18th chapter of Genesis, it's sort of marked by understatement. Because Abraham starts out and says, why don't you just stop for a little while? I'll bring you a little water and you can wash your feet and relax. And he says, while you do that, I'll get you a little bit of food. And the three strangers say yes. And then Abraham kicks into high gear. Because what he does is he rushes inside the tent and he enlists the help of his wife, Sarah. And he tells her to begin to prepare this feast. And there's some things in this text that we can often kind of gloss over if we're not kind of almost looking with some kind of resource book at the same time. Because what Abraham tells his wife is he says, I want you to take 3 seahs, S-E-A-H, of flour and make some bread. Well, the problem is that 3 seahs of flour is enough to bake 50 loaves of 1-pound loaves of bread. And he's only got 3 people that he's going to serve food to. But apparently Sarah does as she's told. Then he goes out the other side of the tent, and he goes into the field and gets one of his servants and says, I want you to slaughter an entire fatted calf, and we're going to roast it, and then we're going to serve dinner to these 3 guests. So he's asked him to turn aside for a little while, but obviously there are hours of preparation that go into all this. And then when all the food is prepared with, it says with milk and curds, that Abraham then goes and serves these 3 strangers. And the way it's described, he does it not as a traditional host at that period, but actually as a servant. They recline and he stands and he serves them. Now, if you know this text well, as the meal's coming to an end, the 3 strangers reveal that they're actually angelic messengers. And they've come to share with Abraham and Sarah in their old age that God hasn't forgotten the promises that God made years and years before, that Abraham would be the father of many nations and all these wonderful things. And the angels say, it's time. At this point, Sarah is going to conceive and bear a child, and his name will be Isaac. And this narrative, just stuck there in the 18th chapter of Genesis, actually became a kind of prototype, an image that impacted Jewish thought for the rest of the biblical time, including into the modern era. Abraham's actions in that moment become the epitome of what hospitality looks like. To just kind of go overboard, to welcome the stranger, and to just do all sorts of extravagant things to show kindness. Now, that idea not only runs through Jewish culture and writings for 2,000, at this point really, 3,500 years, but it also sneaks into the New Testament. There is a passage in the letter to the Hebrews, in the 13th chapter, where the author says, let mutual love continue, but do not neglect to show hospitality to strangers. For in so doing, others have entertained angels unawares. Clearly a reference back to Genesis 18. But there's something going on in that tiny little passage in the letter to the Hebrews that gets lost when we translate it into English. All of the New Testament, as many of you are aware, was written in Greek. And in Greek, that tiny little fragment of the 13th chapter of Hebrews actually says this: let Philadelphia continue, but do not neglect Philoxenia. And so I decided that up here at Lakeside, which is this wonderful learning community, I'm going to teach you a tiny bit of Greek. I thought it would be fun, all right? Furthermore, you know more Greek than you may think you do, because there are 2 words here, and it's this word play. Continue Philadelphia, do not neglect Philoxenia. Well, Philadelphia actually is exactly what you think it is. It's the same word as that name of that city on the east coast of Pennsylvania. And again, you know more Greek than you may realize, because Philadelphia, work with me now, is the city of... You all know Greek. I mean, isn't it amazing? Just coming to Lakeside makes you smarter. All right. And that's exactly what it means. Philadelphia is a compound word in Greek. Phila always means love. It's one of 3 Greek words for love. And Delphia means brothers or brothers and sisters. And stuck together here, Philadelphia means to love the brothers and sisters that are already part of the household of faith. But the text says, let Philadelphia continue, but do not neglect Philoxenia. And Philoxenia is also a compound word in Greek. If we get there, and if not, we have Sue's. This is my wife, Sue Wolf, by the way, and she's helping me out here. Yeah, that's right. Anyway, when we eventually get there, or I can do it even if it won't advance. So if Philoxenia is this compound word, again, philo still means love, and xenia is a Greek word that means stranger. And that word sneaks into English occasionally For example, some of you may know what it means to be xenophobic, right? I mean, it's to have a fear of strangers. And so in Greek, the word that we translate as hospitality literally means love the stranger that God has sent to be your neighbor. And so in this passage in Hebrews, what it's simply saying is, to be the church, first and foremost, you can't be an authentic expression of the body of Christ if we can't figure out how to love the brothers and sisters who are already there with us. But to really be the church of Jesus Christ, you can't stay in Philadelphia your whole life. You got to move from Philadelphia and risk moving out into Philadelphia. You have to figure out how to love the strangers that God has sent to be our neighbors. And so I share all of that because as we were launching the free store that became the impetus to do this Church for All People and all these other things now, again, like I said, with 35,000 different people that we interact with every year, we decided from the very beginning that if this thing was going to work at all, if we were going to bridge these differences, we wanted to experience and share radical hospitality. So I want to talk with you just a little bit about what hospitality looks like at the United Methodist Free Store, and then by extension, kind of build on that to think about how that impacts our other ministries or any ministries that you may be part of. So first of all, hospitality in the Free Store at its initial level is pretty much what you might just assume it would be. In other words, we try to be really friendly. You know, when people come in the door, there's a kind of a hospitality table. We have volunteers and/or staff that greet people. You know, it's a little bit like seeing the Walmart greeter when you come in inside. We're just trying to be nice, right? And then when you come in, one of the things that's also nice about the places where we serve lots of low-income people is the place we worship during the week is called we turn into what we call the Hospitality Center. And there's always coffee. It's cool and air conditioned in the summer. It's warm in the winter. It's dry when it's raining. It's just a place of welcome. As a matter of fact, after the Free Store had been open only for a few weeks, Sue and I realized that some of the volunteers had coined this phrase that stuck with us for 25 years. It simply says, if the doors are unlocked, the coffee pot is on. And it's true, there's always free coffee in the Free Store. Well, people like this, and it begins to communicate that we really do care about you. And the other thing is, so many people shop each day in the Free Store that the average person has to wait 30 minutes or so for their turn to shop. But again, everybody can relax, they kind of hang out together, and it gives opportunities for us to get to know people and build relationships. Pretty basic stuff, right? But there are then additional levels of hospitality that we built into this Free Store. The next level is actually its location itself. I know there are some of you who are here and from Central Ohio or been in and out. Well, Parsons Avenue, where the Free Store is located, is historically the dividing line on the south side of Columbus between white folks and black folks. Historically, since the 1950s at least, there have been black folks on the east side of Parsons Avenue and white folks on the west side of Parsons Avenue. And this goes back, in fact, all the way to what's known as redlining, where banks literally drew lines through communities to say they would lend money, in the case of the south side, on the west side of the street, but not on the east side of the street. And so Parsons Avenue, in many ways, is the dividing, the separation in our community. But Parsons Avenue itself has always belonged to everybody. The buses run up and down there, the library's on Parsons Avenue, the post office, Children's Hospital is up at one end of it, and a lot of businesses. And so when we put the Free Store on Parsons Avenue, we signaled to people in this deeply racially divided community that we wanted it to be for everybody. It didn't matter whether you were black or white. Come check us out. We're on the avenue, and the avenue belongs to everyone. Well, as we've grown over time, we've moved the Free Store, and we're now in our third location in the Ministry Center, the first time we've owned a building on the south side. But we've always stayed on Parsons Avenue because we are concerned that if we would ever move even one block in either direction, we might miscommunicate our intentions. And all of a sudden, people would assume we're just for the black folks or we're just for the white folks. It's simple, and maybe it's subtle, but it's mattered. In other words, from the very first day we opened the Free Store, it's been this amazing blend of white and black folks. And in part, that's because of a decision about the physical location as a sign of hospitality. But then there's another third entire aspect of what we are doing with hospitality. The part that I think is actually the secret sauce and why the whole thing has worked. And it might not even seem like hospitality at the beginning. But the third component, and it is built into the very DNA of this Free Store, is that there are no eligibility requirements at all. In other words, if you want to come shop, you can shop. You can be the wealthiest person in Central Ohio. You can be the poorest. You can have any amount of education or lack of education. You can have documentation or not documentation. If you want to come and shop, come. There are no eligibility requirements because, as far as we're concerned, you are already eligible. You are a beloved child of God. You are worthy, and you don't have to prove that you're worthy of our charity. That might not seem like a lot, but it catches particularly low-income people by surprise in our community. I don't know if any of you have ever been part of a thing like a food pantry or some other program in your own church or community, and often there are guidelines. In other words, if you want to get benefits from some particular direct service, you have to live in the right area, or your income has to be below a certain level, or whatever other factors. But at the Free Store, we decided to just throw that all out from day one. We wanted to create an environment where everyone would feel welcome. Or another way, talk about this very briefly and then I'll move on, is that sometimes, particularly across the years, as I've talked to groups of United Methodist women or now United Women of Faith, I'll do this little thing, and I'll simply ask the people in the room, and it would probably work here, and again, it's a somewhat rhetorical question, but I want to know how many of you right now have, and we'll divide it in two groups, how many of you may have pictures of your children or your grandchildren with you? Okay, that's one group. And how many of you have the birth certificates of those children or grandchildren? Because I'll tell you, if you have pictures and not the birth certificate, I can almost guarantee you're middle-class folks. But if I'm in a room where folks are carrying the birth certificates of their kids with them, pretty certain these are low-income folks. You know, because believe it or not, many low-income moms and grandmoms who, if they're responsible for their grandkids, carry those documents with them all the time. Because they never know when somebody that they want help from is going to demand that they can prove that they own their own kids. And as middle-class folks, we normally don't worry about that. I mean, we just assume, you know, if we show up with our kids or our grandkids, they're going to believe us. They're ours, you know. And here are the pictures if you want to see them. And so to drive that image just a little bit further, because it still happens. You know, we still see people who come for the very first time, and often they'll come and it's just an image, but there'll be a mom, and she'll have a pocketbook, and there may be kind of an envelope, a little envelope inside, and she'll open it up, and then she'll begin to take out the birth certificates of her kids. And some of these, if you've ever done this kind of ministry where these are required, these birth certificates are literally Scotch taped back together. And it's not because they got mad at one point and said, I'm so sorry I brought you into this world and I'm going to take you back out. I mean, it's not that. It's they folded and unfolded those birth certificates so many times that they literally have to be Scotch taped back together. But in the Free Store, we decided we wanted to create a different level of hospitality. You don't have to prove that you're worthy to be here. You're worthy. God loves you. God made you. And then let's form this community one with another. Well, you may feel that I'm kind of driving this home too much, but the point that I want to make with it is that this emphasis on hospitality has allowed us to have a framework from which we can then build and try to establish meaningful, deepening levels of mutuality with the people who come. So I think what we're going to do is I'm going to bring up a brief video. This is a video sort of like the one that I showed yesterday that we didn't produce ourselves. This was done about 7 or 8 years ago by a business group of folks who were doing a leadership training for an extended period of time, and they sent some of their people to be with us. And as we kept talking about hospitality and how this is part of the ethos of who we are, they decided to help us as we trained our own staff and volunteers on hospitality to produce a video that hopefully would show images of what this is and why it matters. So we're gonna bring that up, I think, and while Sue is, the computer seems to be slow, but while she's doing that, what I would, okay, what I would say is she's looking for that, is that that our efforts in this kind of hospitality, they allow us, if you think about it, everything that I was describing, are we ready to go? Okay, is that it's unilateral, as you see. In other words, nobody can stop you from extending hospitality. And I'll talk more about that after we look at the video.
Radical hospitality is a key concept in all that we do in ministry through community development for all people. We're a faith-based organization. I'm a United Methodist pastor, and what we're doing with radical hospitality is actually grounded in an understanding of the biblical term. And the Greek word that we translate as hospitality is philoxenia. It's a compound word, it has 2 parts. The first part means love, phila, and the second part, xenia, means stranger. So in its original form in the early Christian community, hospitality meant to love the stranger that God has sent to be a neighbor. So for us then, radical hospitality is how we're reaching those people that have been marginalized, others aren't interested in. And we do that in various ways. Part of that is the simple notion of authentic welcome, the ability to want to get to know a person, to listen to them, to hear their story. So part of hospitality is just being present. It's expressing love in those simple forms. Yeah, it starts with a smile, it continues with listening, and then it's about vulnerability, the ability to engage in relationships of authentic mutuality, where we are sharing who we are at the same time we're listening to that other person.
Because you never know what people are going through, and I remember one lady said she was going through some, and when I gave her a hug, it meant the world to her. So I think people like to feel good about themselves when they come here, and it makes me feel good to see them smiling and everything.
Radical hospitality to me means being a welcoming place, being a place where every person who walks in the doors feels that they belong here. And to me, radical hospitality is as important, if not more important, than the goods that we deliver. So we're not only trying to hand people clothes or produce to help them in their lives, but to give them a place where they feel welcome and included.
It matters. It matters how you treat somebody when they walk in that door. And even if they're a little grouchy to you or something, if you're just able to blow that off and they come back the next week and they're like, oh, I love this place, you know, I'm treated so great, you know, thank you. So yeah, that makes a lot. And God plays a big role in all that,
Radical hospitality for us makes a difference, for people to know that they are welcome and accepted. And it means that we're all in this together. trying to create a peaceable kingdom that has been ongoing for us. We're unashamedly faith-based. And so that radical hospitality is not only do we extend it, we want you to extend it to one another. And that has been a journey, still is, for us to understand what that really means. The fact that everyone is accepted means we all have to work on everyone being accepted and being hospitable to one another.
Our acts of radical hospitality remind people from the very beginning that someone does care about them. Someone's trying to reach them. And so it matters because it breaks down barriers. And when it works, when it really works, it moves very quickly to mutuality. You know, as we're extending that welcome, we're also inviting people to return our love, with their affirmation, their welcome.
So I think it's really key in our work, whoever we are, whether we are a volunteer, whether we are a full-time employee, whether we're a student working it through the university, that we recognize that the first job that we have is to form a relationship with the people who come into this building, whether they're strangers or whether we've known them every day.
They are trying to uplift people, for sure. And that is so key. And your self-confidence is what's going to allow you to step up. But if you don't have that and you don't have anyone providing that, it's not going to work. And they do that. They provide that just in simple interactions.
They just give me a big hug without hugging. You understand what I'm saying? And that's about it.
It's people being authentic and valuing one another and taking the initiative to make someone else feel welcome, to slow down and listen to another person.
We say all the time, coffee pot's on. It's been 12 years. Coffee and sugar are an expensive venture. And for us, they continue to prove how radical hospitality really works. And it does rub off. People in the free store waiting area are hospitable with one another and start to have conversations. And that's what you want.
Well, I hope, if nothing else, you get some images of the work we're doing and the people that we interact with. And so I want to build on this and invite you to think a little bit more about this, and I'm going to shift to one other idea of touching grace. But as I was starting to say right before the video did come up, if you think about it, one of the cool things about hospitality is it starts out unilateral and nobody can stop you from doing it. If we go back for just a moment to the story of Abraham, right? There in the 18th chapter of Genesis, this 100-year-old guy sees three strangers and he jumps up and he just decides that he's going to be hospitable. He has no idea initially how those three folks are going to respond. But nobody can stop him from making the offer. And I think this is a key component that I'd like you to wrestle with. You know, he says, will you turn aside? They may or may not. When they agree to do it, he then decides that he's going to up his own game, and instead of just, rest for a few minutes, I'll get you a little something to eat, he is the one who decides to do this big banquet. And he hopes in some way they'll respond. He doesn't even know exactly what that'll be. He has no idea that they're messengers from God. And yet his initial hospitality triggers this positive response. And that's been our experience. And it's that reality that I'd like to invite you to ponder how it may relate to how you're living your life and any church or ministry or program you're part of. You see, over and over again in this free store, but in all of our ministries, we're trying to bridge these differences that plague our society in such deep, painful ways. Separations of race and social class. And we can't guarantee that we can bridge that, but what we can do is start. We can show somebody that we care about them, that we're glad they're there. And so many times people reciprocate in a positive way. And then we can build on relationships going forward. And so once we get started, I mean, it's real basic stuff from there. You know, if I share my name, in fact, my basic way in this, even now when I'm retired, just go up to people and say, hey, I'm Pastor John, what's your name? And then it's amazing how many times people are gonna tell me their name. And then we can sit down and we can begin to have a conversation. And in ministries that we do, particularly ministries, not just us, but any church that are trying to bridge differences, I would invite you to try to reflect further, in essence, to do kind of a hospitality inventory. And so to finish out this section, I want to lift up for you kind of a hypothetical. You know, there are a lot of churches that will do a community meal, maybe once a month, sometimes once a week. And in a lot of these meals, the idea is we're going to show that we care, and we're going to feed people from our neighborhood that may not have enough money to have food on an ongoing basis for themselves and their families. What I found is that in some of these meals, when I go and I talk to folks in these churches, sometimes folks are really frustrated and say, well, it doesn't seem to be working very well. And in the worst case image, and some of you may have seen this, you know, what will happen is that the people who are going to come and dine, you know, all line up, and then at the right time, the doors are open and they come into the church fellowship hall. And I've often wondered about how many of our church kitchens and fellowship halls are configured. Many of you can probably picture this thing, you know, where the kitchen's next to the fellowship hall and there's that big pass-through window, right, you know, between the two. And in the kind of worst scenarios that hopefully we don't default to, then all those low-income folks who are the diners pass through on one side of the window, right? And the food's kind of shoved through to them, and everybody from the church huddles there inside the kitchen. And then the people who are the diners go sit at the tables in the fellowship hall. And then when they're done, if there's food left over, the people from the church come out from the kitchen, sit down, and eat separately. And nobody gets to know anybody. You know, and yet it's possible to just flip the script. It's possible to design that exact same experience to maximize hospitality. In that case, then you've got a greeter at the beginning, and everybody's invited to sit down, and the people from the church are asked to eat with the people who come through that aren't members of the church. And then you can spend the time to get to know people and to begin to talk and build relationships over time. As I finish this, think about it in one other way. At least in my case, there has never been a meaningful relationship in my entire life where I didn't get to know the name of the person I was building a relationship with. And yet, how many times do our churches do food pantries or feeding ministries and other things where we never get to know the names of the people? I mean, we may know, oh, you know, the tall guy with the beard or the short lady that always mumbles to herself, but that's not the same as knowing somebody's name. And so I just invite you to ponder as we do ministry, whether it is in a local church in an inner city neighborhood, whether it's just being part of the Lakeside community, what does it look like to practice radical hospitality? And I would suggest to you that that is at the heart of how we were able to create what is in many ways the most diverse United Methodist worshiping congregation in this country. All right, now I want to pivot, but before we check the clock, I want to take a moment or two here just to ask, does any feedback on that? Does that make sense? Do you have any questions or responses? And then we're going to shift to this other concept of touching grace. But any thoughts about this notion of hospitality? Yes. Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's on. I think so.
I had a chance to be at St. Paul in Dayton, Ohio,
Sure.
in the east area.
Yeah.
And we had one of our general helpers who met with groups who were bringing food in to serve, who were in the line, as you described, but that they were invited to make sure that some of them were eating together. At the end, we had a really skillful person who helped debrief them on what they learned, who they met, and any questions they might have about the neighborhood. So we were bringing largely suburban people in to be in part of what was actually the highest number of opiate overdoses in the nation per capita. So anyhow, the ability to actually think that a part of the customer is the people who's coming to serve as well.
Yeah, very good point. And so, and at our best, we've tried to do that, and yeah, we want to create a sense of community that that bridges differences, including the differences between did you come as a volunteer, from another church, or do you live, in our case, in this neighborhood on the south side? Really good point. Anybody else with a, yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Well, this is maybe, you mentioned yesterday about Andrew saying, well, we've got these, fish and loaves, what good are they? So unfortunately, this might be a little Andrew-ish type question. My church had a clothing store, and unfortunately, we found out that people were taking advantage.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
People would take many, items of clothing, and apparently they maybe had some sort of other store where they sold the clothing into their neighborhood, and so I don't know. I'm wondering if you've run into the. Unfortunately, it seems like you're going to have people who like game the system, or are doing things that you kind of think, well, that's not really, you're not really following the rules. Yeah. But with radical hospitality, I wonder if you've dealt with that or have any recommendations about that.
Yes, two things. One, I promise within about 5 minutes I'm going to talk a lot more about that, but to honor the question in the moment. Yeah, there certainly are times when in any of our programs, particularly since most of them we don't have any eligibility requirements, where folks will wonder, are people participating in the spirit of the endeavor? And yes, there are times in our free store, undoubtedly, where people will take things and then turn around and try to sell them. For Sue and I, and for the others that have been in this for 25 years now, what I would say is that we have come to the place of deciding, and it doesn't mean we're right, but we just don't worry about it. Okay? What we decide is that we know why we're offering it. Back to this notion of hospitality being unilateral. In other words, we make a decision to try to do something to express our concern, our interests, our affirmation of you as an individual. And you're going to do with that what you choose to do. You may treasure it, you may build to a relationship, or you may take advantage of it. And I'm retired now, but I want to get ready to say it's even a theme I would preach on from time to time. I decided a long time ago that if I end up in trouble when I get to the heavenly gates, I want the problem to be that I was too kind, I was too generous, I was not judgmental enough. I've just decided that that if I'm going to mess it up, I'm going to mess it up on the notion of God loves you just the way you are. God's not finished with you yet. And I'm not trying to make light of it. It is very frustrating and disturbing at times to see people game the system. So I'm not trying to denigrate that reality. I'm just trying to say that for Sue and for me and for some others, it just seems to work a lot better in our spirits to not try to focus on that. Just one other real quick thing in there is that this is a true story. This happened maybe 15 years ago. The free store was open one day. I was there, and a police officer came in, literally kind of dragging with him a guy that was holding a television, and the person was saying, "I'm pretty sure this guy stole something from you." And by the way, it did turn out that this guy had taken a TV from the free store that was actually somebody else had already selected it but hadn't taken it yet, and so the police officer said to me, he said, "So do you want me to arrest him?" And so it led in the moment to me saying, no, we're just going to take the TV and get it to the right person. But it has led me to think across the years about the fact, is it possible to steal from a store where everything is free? I mean, it's sort of an interesting question, kind of an existential one. But it gets to the point. These are issues. and yet how are we going to choose to deal with them? So a good question, and I'm going to come back and say a lot more about another aspect of it, for what really does drive us. But anybody else, and maybe do one more, and then I'll pick up the theme again. Yeah.
I would just love to hear a little bit about how you train volunteers. I've had a variety of experiences of service related to that, and people are afraid of differences, they're afraid of germs, they're afraid of whatever.
Yeah.
Just talk a little bit about how you prepare.
Sure. So what I'm going to say is that, we've been doing this for 25 years. There are some seasons when we've been really good on training volunteers, some where we undoubtedly could have done better. But our intention, what we strive to do, is when we have people who are going to come as ongoing volunteers. I want to draw a distinction between people who just come for one time only. We attempt to share these key concepts that are talked about in the book, but here. I mean, this video was truly developed so that we could use it in training volunteers. I mean, that was why it was there. We also use it with any time we have new staff. And another part of the training that, again, I'm going to come back to in a minute, is we do worship services 4 days a week right before the free store opens. They're fairly brief services, anywhere from 15 to 30 minutes. But those services are where we rehearse our own core values. And so whether you're a shopper or a volunteer, we are attempting to affirm, actually inside a context of worship, who we are, what matters to us, and what we would like you to do. On the other side, and then maybe I'll close with this on that. Some of the stuff about how to be a volunteer in the free store is really pretty simple. Many folks who are shoppers then become volunteers. And again, from the early days, one of the main jobs is, right, we get donations and people sort through the stuff and then they put it out on racks and shelves. And probably the earliest precise teaching thing was simply this one line. In the free store, put like things together. So in other words, you put all the shirts together, you put things together by sizes. I just put like things together. It's not that complex. So different levels of training, and a lot of it just by an accompaniment model of modeling this accepting, loving behavior. Okay. What I'd like to do with the second half of our time is I want to shift and talk about one other really key notion. I want to talk about the importance of grace. I'm going to pick up the Bible here for just a moment. Obviously grace is central to all of who we are as Christian folks. We like singing songs like Amazing Grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. Grace is a central part of for the Methodist folks here, of the Wesleyan understanding of how God is at work in the world. And I just want to read, to get us as a springboard into this next topic, a small section from the first chapter of the Gospel of John, what's sometimes referred to as the prologue to John's Gospel. And there John writes, "And the Word became flesh and lived among us. And we have seen his glory as the glory of the Father's only Son, full of grace and truth." And then 2 verses later, John goes on and says, "From Christ's fullness we have all received grace upon grace. The law indeed was given through Moses, grace and truth came through Jesus Christ." So from the very beginning of the opening of the Gospel of John, the whole stories of Jesus and the rest of the New Testament, there's this tremendous emphasis upon grace. And in our ministries, at Church for All People, all of the stuff going back to the free store, we have been trying to figure out how to make grace tangible. In other words, how do you touch grace? And so I want to chat with you a bit about that, and by the time I'm done, hopefully have gotten you intrigued with the notion of how are you going to make certain that you touch grace and help the people around you in your family, in your church, in your community, to have the experience of literally touching grace. So to bring this into context, we're going to do the second half of our Greek lesson. Remember, we're learning Greek today. So the word grace is actually the translation of a Greek word because, right, the whole New Testament was written in Greek. And that Greek word is charis, all right? And charis, in 2,000 years ago, in the Greek of that day, was a very common word. And in ordinary Greek, the Greek of that time and culture was called Koine Greek. Charis simply meant gift, right? So if you like somebody and you were going to show your appreciation or affection, you might give them a charis. You would give them a gift. Maybe you were going to go to somebody's birthday party and you brought a birthday charis with you. That's all the word meant. It just meant gift. Well, in the early church, by the time John's writing, the word charis begins to take on this really nuanced additional meaning. In the early church, charis still means gift, but it begins to mean any gift that comes from God or from God in Jesus Christ. And that meaning of charis actually still sneaks into the English language in other words. For example, we've all heard the term, that person is charismatic. And what charismatic actually means is to be filled with the gifts of the Holy Spirit. Likewise, depending on the church tradition you come out of, we have a lot of different words for Holy Communion, Lord's Supper, but many of you are familiar with another term called Eucharist, right? And Eucharist is just another Greek word. It's one of those compound words. EU in Greek always means good, and charis still means gift. So Eucharist literally means the good gifts of God in the bread and in the cup of Holy Communion. Pretty simple, right? The grace is a translation of a Greek word, charis, and charis means any gift from God. Now, we get to what I think is the fun part. Now I get to tell you why everything in the free store has to be free. There are at least 80 others of these free stores around the country, and they all have in common some of the exact same ethos. No eligibility requirements, and it has to be free. And it has to be free because that's how people touch grace. Literally touch grace. When you come shop in the free store, you receive a free gift offered in the name of Jesus, and it is the ability to touch grace. If I still don't have you completely with me yet, let's just try to use our imaginations a very little bit. Let me tell you a bit about a person whose name is Mary. Mary has been coming to shop in the free store for years now. Mary comes a lot, and she has a pattern. When she comes into the free store, she almost always shops for her kids first. She has a son and she has a daughter. And so I want you to imagine Mary comes in the free store and she goes for the section that has clothing for children, and she looks in the section for boys, and maybe she finds a couple of t-shirts that she thinks that her son is going to enjoy, and maybe they have names of teams or Ohio State University, which is the center of the sports universe in Central Ohio. Anyway, she picks some things for her son, she holds them up, and when she picks up that t-shirt, it's a free gift, and she has picked up grace. She literally has. That's the literal meaning of the word. And then she goes on and she goes over to where there's clothing for girls, and maybe she finds a pair of jeans or a blouse, and she thinks her daughter's going to like them, and so she gathers them up and she keeps going. She shops next for her husband, and then she goes through the houseware section, and maybe she finds some glasses or a pan, and she takes those things and she's just gathering up grace as she goes. At the end, Mary shops last normally just for herself, and picture her standing in front of a mirror, and she's found maybe a dress, and she holds it up, and she's holding up grace in front of her. Well, at the end of that, and you saw these images as they were going by in the video, she goes to the checkout counter. Everything's free, but we keep a list of how many items people are taking, and then the folks there gather up all these items, all the grace that Mary has selected, and they put them in shopping bags. And Mary walks out of our free store carrying bags of grace with her. Now, Mary used to live in the immediate neighborhood of the church, but a couple years ago, she moved a bit further, and now she lives about 2 miles away. And much of the time, Mary just walks home carrying bags of grace with her. But sometimes, if she's really tired or she's got a little bit of money, she'll wait for the bus. The bus stop is right in front of our ministry center. And picture Mary getting up on the bus, and she sits down, and she holds in her lap overflowing bags of God's grace. And then I want you to imagine the bus arrives or she's walked. She comes to her front door. She walks into her very modest home. And at least in my imagination, she then spreads out the items that she got at the free store and waits for her kids to come home from school. And again, at least the way I image it, the kids come through the front door and they see that their mom has been shopping at the free store again. They look and they see there are a couple of items for each of them, and this time they're things they really like and they are delighted. Well, if Mary's kids are anything like my granddaughters, if they get new clothing one day and if they like it, they're going to wear it the next day, right? And so I want you then to imagine Mary's son and daughter, they get up the next morning and they take the items that they received from the free store and then they put them on and they go out into their challenging world, literally clothed in God's grace. Everything is free in the free store because we want to make certain that everybody has the experience of touching grace. Now, I think you probably understand what I'm saying, but I do these kinds of conversations and sessions in a lot of places, and I'm mindful. I mean, it's not lost on me that you can say, yeah, well, wait a minute, that's all cute, but that's not really what we mean by grace, is it? And I would say to you, well, then what do you mean by grace? But even more, I want to drive this a little bit further, because for me, this is at the key of why what we are doing has worked and how it is ministry where the total is greater than the sum of the parts. We do all these things, and we want to make certain that as much of what we do as possible is free so people can touch grace. Now I will pause and say, and I promise that I don't want to get distracted, that there are people who see things in different ways. There are a number of churches that run wonderful ministries that are thrift shops, and they sell things at very discounted rates, and part of the logic is, well, that this may help people have more of a sense of self-respect because then they paid something for it. And the older I get, the more convinced I am personally that I have stopped criticizing anybody that is trying to do anything good, and I'm willing to embrace that they've got their reasons for it. All I'm saying to you is we know why everything in the free store is free, because we want to make certain that everybody who shops, everybody who volunteers, is aware that they are touching grace from God. So for us, it is foundational. Now, what I would then go on to say next is, as you think about, okay, yeah, but does this thing really work, is I think you have you would be right to raise the question, yeah, but who's paying attention, right? I mean, Mary's coming to shop, for crying out loud. Does she really thinking about the fact that that grace is the English translation of a Greek word charis, and every gift that's offered in the name of God and Jesus Christ is grace? Well, she may or may not be thinking about it in the moment, but this is where for Methodist folks, our Wesleyan theology, going back to John Wesley, the founder of the Methodist movement, is so incredibly helpful. As a matter of fact, our preacher of the week, Pastor Grace, yesterday referred very briefly to what I want to emphasize a bit more. And that is that John Wesley suggested that grace moves through every one of our lives, and there's kind of a progression of at least 3 key aspects of grace. And he said grace starts out with what he calls prevenient grace. It's the grace that surrounds us before we have any awareness of what God's up to in our lives. Prevenient grace, it's really cool. It is there from the moment that you were born. In many of our church traditions, infant baptism is actually this great expression of the reality of prevenient grace. You know, that infant that's baptized isn't confessing their sins, but we are celebrating this child come into this world is already surrounded by a grace of God that's going to watch over them and nurture them over time. So particularly for Methodist folks, but for most Christians, we have this understanding that God's grace is working whether we're paying attention or not. And so, yeah, 20,000 folks shopped in the free store last year. And for a number of those folks, it was just prevenient grace. They were gifts, they got it from God, and they weren't thinking about it at the time. But that's okay, because what Wesley was also saying is that it's up to us. It's up to us who have faith in God and Jesus Christ. It's up to us who love to sing the songs about amazing grace, how sweet the sound. It's up to us to help people awaken to what God is doing. So in this free store, and then this church and everything else we're doing, trying to build a front porch of the kingdom of God that radiates out into an entire community of 20,000 folks. Well, what we're up to, it's our job to help make the connection. And so as I mentioned briefly before, we do worship services right before the free store opens. They're not mandatory, but a lot of people come early and are hanging around, and a lot of people want to be there. And so we rehearse these themes relentlessly over and over again. We talk about the fact that we live inside a divine economy of abundance. We invite people to think about the importance of radical hospitality and how do we take the first step and show we care about folks. And maybe more than anything else, we talk about grace. In other words, I would contend there are probably a higher percentage of people in the low-income neighborhood on the south side of Columbus than anywhere else in America that know that grace is an English translation of a Greek word charis, and charis means any gift from God. You know, if you shop in a free store, you're going to know it. Right? And then when we open up the free store, I mean, after whatever worship is going on, what we tell the people is, when you shop today, you will touch grace. We say to people, when you take something home with you, you're taking God's grace with you. And what Wesley said was, you know, in the church, what are we up to? Well, God's prevenient grace is there. And in the church, we're trying to get folks to what Wesley called the moment of awareness, justifying grace. For those of you really Wesley scholars, he said that often comes with a moment of conviction. And then we come to this awareness that God loves us anyway. Not because of what we've done or failed to do, but God just loves us that much. And this justifying grace claims us. And we come to this moment of deep awareness and appreciation of how much God loves each of us. And that's what we're trying to do. That's what this ministry in its essence is about. Helping people to touch grace. For many, it starts as a prevenient grace. But get to the place where we get it, where we really understand, or at least begin to understand, and we respond to that outpouring love of a gracious God. And if you are good folks in your knowledge of the Wesleyan understanding of grace, we're not quite done yet. John Wesley said there's prevenient grace and justifying grace, but then he said there's what he called sanctifying grace. It's that journey towards Christian perfection. Once we become aware and realize that God loves us just this much, then all the rest of our lives is this ongoing journey to take the grace that has been given to us and to share that graciously out into the world. And so a lot of the folks you were seeing in this video on either side of the counter, these are folks who have been shopping and have come to this awareness and are touching God's grace, but then they want to give forward. It amazes me how many people that shop in our free store also donate to the free store. That might surprise you, but you know, folks who have kids, and when they outgrow the clothing, even if it was secondhand when they got it, and the clothes are still wearable, they'll donate it forward. many people shop in the free store on behalf of other people. They'll see something and think that my friend or my cousin would like that. And so folks find ways to be involved in what John Wesley would call sanctifying grace, the grace of holiness, of heart, but also of life and service. All right, well, so that's the kind of aspects of what we are trying to communicate through this notion of God, of touching grace. And so what I'd like to do is just slow down a bit on this and ask you to think with me before we open it up into general conversation about, so well, what does that then mean? I mean, in other words, what can we do with this wonderful truth that inside this divine economy of abundance, we can extend radical hospitality, and then we can also help people to touch grace where they are, and the difference that can make in their lives, and how we can build ministries that are grounded in this notion. Because see, what I want to suggest to you is that in every single church, that there are all kinds of opportunities to take a fresh look at what you're doing and simply ask yourselves, is this an opportunity for people to touch grace? And almost always it is. And then simultaneously, are we celebrating that? Are we pointing that out? Or are we just kind of going through the motions? And again, perhaps you're doing a direct service like a food pantry, or maybe you do a community meal, or maybe you have a program for senior citizens for fellowship, or you do an after-school program for kids. All of these things are part of the ministry of your church. They are moments when you are offering forward in the name of Christ something that is free and tangible. And yet, how often are we thinking about that as opportunities to touch grace? And are we making the connection? You see, I've become convinced that often, especially during my time as a district superintendent, that folks have grown weary in some of our churches. And I think it's not because anybody's lost their faith at all. I mean, that can happen, but I don't think that's it most of the time. But I do think we become complacent and we stop celebrating the wonder that all these different things are God's grace coming to us in this abundant fashion. So I would invite you to consider that possibility. Well, I think what I'd like to do now is to open it up for some conversation, and depending on what you raise, I may try to reinforce a couple of the points we talked about. But to what degree does this make sense, or what would you want to challenge or add to? Yeah, see a couple of hands. One there and then right here. Yeah, thank you. I think he got the microphone first, but Charlie's going to bring you a microphone.
So great to hear about the ministry that you've had for 25 years. Mm-hmm. I'm wondering about expanding a little bit within the community. Have you attempted to do things like with youth,
Sure.
like you mentioned, after-school program, or to try, let's say, to deal with violence or some of the issues that are in that community?
Sure. We do a whole series of programming in what we call youth development. That just happens to be the title. But right now, in the middle of the summer, we are operating what's known as freedom schools. They're tied into the Children's Defense Fund, so it's part of a national initiative. So in two different school buildings on the south side, we've got 50 or so kids showing up 5 days a week, 7 or so hours a day throughout the summer, who are involved in this initiative run by our staff that centers in a couple of areas. Its overarching thing is to encourage the self-affirmation and self-development of children and youth. This curriculum that we use, again, that comes from the Children's Defense Fund, is centers on reading, and that around the country, the places that run freedom schools, What we all have in common is that the reading levels of our kids go up over the summer instead of going down. There's a traditional pattern. I mean, even middle-class kids, they get out of school, a lot of times they're not as focused on the educational side, and then they go back in the fall, and it takes a little while to kind of get back up to speed. But there are reading assessments done for all of our kids at the beginning of the summer and at the end of the summer, and almost universally, our kids advance as much as a whole year in reading over the summer. So Freedom School is one of the things we do. During the school year, this kind of converts just into a more traditional after-school program, but that's based in these 2 elementary schools. And so we work with a lot of kids around everything from doing homework to providing additional nutritious food and trying to build a sense of community and reminding kids of their sacred worth. So we do that part. Then it gives me a chance to throw in one other thing. Another aspect that actually my wife, Sue, really launched a number of years ago. Before she retired, she worked for the Ohio Department of Health in maternal and child health. And infant mortality rates are a real issue in this state. Believe it or not, Ohio has one of the highest infant mortality rates in the nation. At least that was the case when we got started in this a decade or so ago. And low-income neighborhoods tend to have higher rates of infant mortality, and also there is a real frustrating dynamic where infant mortality among African Americans is higher than any other racial ethnic group, even when you account for income. And so, what, about 8 years ago now? Is that when we started? In 2014, so 10 years ago, we decided to get involved in trying to deal with infant mortality, because a lot of the studying that was going on then, and there was a lot of emphasis in central Ohio, the city of Columbus, about how just obscenely high infant mortality rates were. At that time, infant mortality on the south side of Columbus kind of paralleled infant mortality rates in Central America, where everybody was born at home and had no access to medical care. And so, so we decided to get involved in this, and this picks up on some of what I was talking about yesterday. We wanted to look at it from an asset-based approach. And so, the problem was there, but instead of just lamenting it, what could we do and what resources could we bring? And so we decided, with Sue's help, to turn the script. And instead of saying, what were we trying to avoid, which was infant mortality, what was the goal? And I remember sitting with Sue one evening and asking her to tell me again, what's the definition of infant mortality? And the definition is that a baby is born, takes a breath, a living breath, and then that baby dies before they reach a year old. And so we were talking and said, I think we got it. We know what the aspirational goal is. If a baby has a first birthday, they can't become an infant mortality statistic. So under Sue's leadership, we launched an entire initiative that continues. The initially was just called First Birthdays. In other words, it's an initiative to make certain that every child on the south side, every child born, has a right to celebrate her or his first birthday. And so part of this is we do birthday parties. I mean, we honestly do. We just gather kids as they have first birthdays, and we celebrate the victory in that. But those parties have also been resource fairs, and we have an accompaniment model where we try to identify every woman in the community who's become pregnant, and then to accompany that mother to be, through her pregnancy, good prenatal care happens, and makes a difference, and then to accompany that family until that baby reaches a year old. And so we've worked now with well over 1,000 households during this 10-year period, and it could change tomorrow, but we actually have an infant mortality rate among the folks we work with that's an absolute zero. In other words, every one of those babies has indeed celebrated her or his first birthday. And so it's a really neat initiative where we've learned a lot about the fact that, by the way, babies tend to thrive if they're born full weight, full term, and it's when they're born too soon and too small that they're most likely to not make it to their first birthday. So this whole model that Sue, with a bunch of really smart people from Children's Hospital, the State of Ohio, Department of Health, and others, developed is, so what can we do as a community to come around families to just make certain our babies are born full weight, full term, and then to support them till they reach their first birthday. I know it took too long on this, and I'm going to get the next question, but the last thing I'd say is that out of this initiative, we now have a second phase, and actually we renamed the whole thing. It's now called Thrive to 5. It still has this big component on making certain every baby has a first birthday. But as we were doing this, we also came to realize that our kids face a second, just horrible challenge, which is on the south side of Columbus. This is true in many other low-income communities. Our little ones, from the age 1 until they head off to kindergarten, face a different kind of challenge. And you can picture it this way. In Columbus, Ohio, anyway, when a kid's normally 5, heads off to kindergarten, in that first few weeks, they actually take a test as soon as you start school. It's called the KRA, or the Kindergarten Readiness Assessment. And on the south side, just over 50% of every child who takes the KRA scores as if they were developmentally 4 years old or younger. So half of our kids start kindergarten a year behind. And it's obscene, you know, when you think about it, because it's really hard to ever catch up. So this same initiative was then expanded to celebrate that parents and grandparents are our kids' first teachers. And what can we do as a community to accompany those families just to make certain that, you know, it's great, you know, we celebrated your child's first birthday and it's a victory. I mean, it's a real victory. But how do we make certain that when that little one is 5, they arrive at kindergarten ready and able from the first day to be up to speed and to continue to thrive? So we put a lot of attention into those kinds of things, trying to come at it from the same perspective of asset-based. We're in it together, we build relationships, and hospitality, all these other factors come together. All right, yeah.
Okay, so mine is going to sound so mundane compared to that one. I'm curious about your administrative board or structure. I'm assuming you are non-for-profit. But I'm curious about the membership within that administrative structure. People of the community, are they on boards, committees, or however it is that you organize your lives?
Sure. Yeah. Yes. Keep it brief, but yes, and then explain it this way. So all the things I'm talking about are now under the umbrella of a chartered United Methodist Church, and so this church has a church council that provides oversight to the church and program life side activities in general, and that's very diverse, made up of all those different kinds of people you saw images of. Then the church actually then owns a separate nonprofit called Community Development for All People, and that board also is made up of a variety of folks. I think, if I'm remembering right, 2/3 of that board has to be United Methodist. Many of those folks are from the congregation. That board, yes, I talked about the fact that to do housing, we'd become what's called a community housing development organization. And the federal rules for that require that 1/3 of the members of the board of the Community Development Corporation have to be low-income people, and we would do that anyway. But so the boards and the folks who structure things are designed to look like the people in the community. I will say, though, it would be a longer topic, and I don't. One of the struggles for us, and it's an ongoing journey. The people who started all this, we were predominantly middle-class folks, and we're still trying to figure out how to really form an authentic community that is as inclusive as possible. And one of the things that we really have learned is this notion of putting people on boards and committees and sitting in rooms and taking minutes is a very middle-class centric way of doing things. And so a lot of what really works best for us is getting people together to do things, to volunteer, stuff we can do with our hands, and that becomes a bigger part of the structure and the process by which we're in this together. And so the more we can get people who participate in a program to then volunteer in it, then they're shaping it in the midst of doing it, of touching it, massaging it, rather than sitting around and having a strategic planning session. And we do some of that. We haven't figured out how not to do that. I mean, we are who we are. But we have become increasingly convinced that that's not the key to it. And so anyway, okay, yes, yeah.
So the experience of early on talking. So I worked for the YMCA, Greater Dayton, for a long time.
Yeah.
We worked on training people on income disparity, so Bridges Out of Poverty, for example, which describes how middle-class people and wealthy people and poor people all have kind of a different value system and work on we were working very hard on being socially mobile, so that a person who maybe is high income would spend time with people who are low income, would understand that their values are not trying to be middle class or upper class, and so that the idea of finding the strength, the asset of each level was important, and to work particularly, I was working particularly with middle class people who did not have a good grasp of a lower income and the values that were being there, and thought that what we were trying to do was motivate everybody to be like us. And that the church in particular, the United Methodist Church, of which I'm clergy, struggles with this a lot. And so that one of the ways we talked about training, so the Bridges Out of Poverty is a really good training for that. I do think the other aspect for me is community development with a larger community of people, which means that whether it's teachers or the universities or healthcare or Care Source or all the other workers together benefit from being with each other, and that the church has a great impact when our value, moral, faith-based piece gets to touch those other organizations as well.
Amen. Yeah, it really is. In the last chapter of the book I wrote, and I'm not going to try to do it here, but we try to get to some of what you're saying at the very end about how does what we do permeate the entire community, and so that we're creating a front porch for all people, a front porch of the kingdom of God, and it's an ongoing journey. But if you are really interested in what he was just saying, the last chapter in the book is an effort to be very intentional about how do you maximize that, and so we continue to wrestle with that. Other folks, thanks.
One of the curses of Columbus right now is the homicide rate in guns. Most of that seems to be in the Linden area and not in your area. Is that something you've addressed with teenagers, or how has that impacted or not impacted your area?
Good question. It is a very significant challenge. We do a lot of things, but I also don't want to pretend that we do everything. Our strength actually is not working with teenagers. I mean, we do stuff with teens. I don't want to, but there are others who do better than we do. So I don't want to misrepresent that. What I would say though is that we do a variety of things to try to promote the South Side as a peaceable kingdom, and just give one real quick little illustration that reflects some of the rest of this. Every year we lead something called the Neighborhood Leadership Academy. It goes for about 9 months. We recruit 20 to 25 people from the community, and we bring them through this process to try to cultivate a different style of leadership that reflects these same values. I mean, we literally teach asset-based community development, a divine economy of abundance. We talk about radical hospitality, touching grace, all this kind of stuff. And then that almost always has some people with graduate degrees and some people who at best, have 5th grade literacy and never finish high school. And sometimes we bring in people who cannot read or write at all. And so we have this wonderful kind of cross-section where people are learning from each other. But what it triggered me, no pun intended, is that each year at the end, we invite people to break into groups and pick a topic they really care about and then go to work on that. And we actually set it up. We have a little bit of grant money. And so we teach people how to write a grant proposal that is asset-based rather than needs-based. And then they get a grant and they go to work. And one of the folks from a couple years ago came up with a program, a very low-income person whose adult daughter was murdered in gun violence. And Steve Allen's very active in the church, and he rallied some other people from the Neighborhood Leadership Academy. And they established this initiative. It's really small, but it's very tangible. And they raise money and get gun locks, literally just, and then they distribute throughout the community, absolutely free of charge, gun locks, so that at least we reduce the probability that someone's going to get shot by sheer accident, with a pistol or firearm that's left unattended. And all I want to say is, does it change everything? It doesn't. But it's also a statement right now in our community that we are not powerless. There are things that we can choose to do at the grassroots level, to try to get involved. And right now, the most recent round of the Neighborhood Leadership Academy, there's a woman who's really concerned about what's happening with teenagers. And so she has this initiative out of the Neighborhood Leadership Academy, working with a small group of teens. And this summer, she actually has those kids out working in a community garden that my wife Sue is coordinating. And so we're just trying to find these tangible ways for people to rally together, care for one another, bridge differences, and image a front porch of the kingdom of God. And we don't have it figured out. Gun violence is an incredible problem in our society and in our community. Not trying to minimize that at all. Yeah. And that is also what she's saying is we have lots of partners. I mean, dozens and dozens of organizations we work through, one of which, Missionary Baptist Church, has a group that is really focused on working with young adults and teens around violence is one. Yeah, and then there's an ongoing initiative. In fact, there's going to be a meeting next week hosted by us about what are we going to do to make the avenue more safe. But we're trying to approach that, quite frankly, by starting with asking for really low-income folks to give their own testimony about how frustrating it is to live in a community with violence, and at the same time, quite frankly, be so distrusting that the police are going to help you rather than harm you. And so we're trying to listen to a myriad of voices. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yep. Anybody else? Guess we're near the end.
Did you see? I don't see another hand. Okay. One more question.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. This may be self-evident, but do you see evidence of all the little pebbles that you're dropping into the pond of grace rippling out and taking over the community and blurring the line of Parsons Avenue and that sort of thing?
Yes, we think we do. And in concise answer, but start with this image. Every year now for the past 4 years, we coordinate a neighborhood festival called Avenue for All. We shut down part of Parsons Avenue, and we just do it as this symbolic statement that Parsons Avenue no longer separates the South Side. It's the point where we can all come together. Now that's a moment in time, but what I'm trying to say to you is that's a philosophy, an attitude. It's a face statement of who we yearn to be, and I at least believe we are truly becoming. There just are 25 years into this. There are so many people on the South Side including very wealthy people in German Village, who now really love the Free Store and bring stuff there. We hang out together on the avenue in ways we didn't before. And if you were here yesterday, I talked to some at the end about our problem right now is we've done so much in housing, we've gotten rid of so much of the blight that our challenge is to not gentrify the place. And yet we've done some really remarkable things in this $150 million of housing to guarantee affordability in much of the South Side. And so, I think we're getting there. It isn't perfect by any stretch, and it's an ongoing journey, and sometimes it feels like it's a step back rather than a step forward. But yes, I believe that throughout Central Ohio now, in government, in all these institutional partners, United Way, the Columbus Foundation, folks look at what we're doing and they want to see that expand on the South Side. Their efforts to replicate up in Linden in particular, just because you mentioned that neighborhood that we're working on right now with Nationwide Children's Hospital in the city of Columbus. So it's a light that shines, and it makes a difference, and so I'm a true believer. I think, inside this divine economy of abundance, take what you have, no matter how meager it seems, and if you offer it forward, God will do something with it. And in that secret sauce, radical hospitality, and remember, it's always a faith witness. Help people touch grace, and then God's going to do the rest. God's pretty good with grace. Yeah. All right, well, thanks much, folks. We really do appreciate it. Yeah. Yeah.
John, thank you so much. We appreciate all of you being here, appreciate the inspiration and the motivation that's been shared. And I want to mention that the books are available. And also, I want to again thank Susan and Peggy for their support in this program. Have a great rest of the day at Lakeside.